Well, this afternoon at the UK Ambassador's residence in Washington, I caught up with our Foreign Secretary Phillip Hammond. I asked about UK arms exports to Saudi Arabia, about our relationship with President Putin, but I began by inquiring whether, given his fears, the Egypt air crash could have been caused by an ISIS bomb, the UK's strategy towards ISIS would now change.
I don't think it changes anything in the way we deal with ISIS. We've always known that they were trying to do us harm. We've seen them executing our citizens. We've seen them committing all sorts of atrocities in areas they control. So we absolutely know what kind of organisation we're dealing with, and we're going after them, and we will continue to go after them. What it does change is the way we deal with the threat, because now that would suggest, if this is what has happened, that would suggest that there is a threat to civil aviation from ISIS, which we have to respond to.
So when you say going after them, Michael Fallons said it's morally indefensible not to bomb ISIS in Syria. Do you agree?
What Michael Fallons said was that he has a difficulty with the idea that our allies are taking action on the basis of British reconnaissance flights, but we have to leave somebody else to carry out the strike.
But he said morally indefensible.
It's no secret that we would like to be able to extend our strike operations into Syria. But we have to get that through the House of Commons. We will go back to the House of Commons as soon as we're confident that we can win a vote in the House of Commons. This should be done on the basis of a broad consensus in the House of Commons. That has always been the tradition in Britain when we're sending our armed forces into combat, that we do it on the basis of a broad consensus. I think that is deliverable, but the changes in the Labour leadership have created some uncertainty about the dynamics in the Commons, and we've got to let that settle down. We've got to understand how the numbers will stack up.
You think it's the right thing to do then, which suggests that you think the bombing has achieved things so far by the UK and Iraq, by the US and allies in Iraq and Syria.
Yes.
What's it achieved?
Well, first of all, the intervention in Iraq, the use of Allied air power, coalition air power in Iraq, stopped what was a precipitate advance towards Baghdad. If you take your mind back 18 months, Baghdad looked as though it was going to fall to the ISIL advance.
You think it would have fallen without that?
Well, I think there was a serious risk. We stopped it in its tracks. Since that time, ISIL have lost control of about 30% of the territory they occupied in Iraq at the peak of their power. So it has had an effect, but we've also always said that you can't win a war against an organisation like ISIL by air power alone. Excuse me, by air power alone. Eventually, there will have to be a ground force dimension to this combat.
A ground force of what kind of troops?
Well, it won't be British or American or European troops. It will have to be people from the region. Ideally, in Iraq, it will be Iraqi forces raised and trained in Iraq, and a force that is reflective of the population of the areas that ISIL currently operates.
That means in Syria then? Who are our partners on the ground in Syria?
In Syria, we have a moderate opposition force, somewhere between 60 and 80,000 fighters on the ground now, primarily fighting the Assad regime, but who are also strongly opposed to ISIL decisively.
Just talk me through that slowly, because if we're attacking ISIS and succeeding under this scenario, then the beneficiary is Assad. So how are the people that are currently fighting Assad going to be helping us?
Well, not the case, because as the Assad regime is not in practice fighting ISIL. There's a couple of points of contact between the regime and ISIL forces, but primarily the regime is being challenged by non-ISIL moderate opposition groups and al-Nusra. ISIL, in their stronghold in Raqqa, has quite carefully kept itself disengaged from the main fighting with the regime. And actually, we know that the regime has done deals with ISIL. They trade with ISIL.
You concede, though, that if ISIS were weakened, Assad would be stronger?
If ISIS were weakened, well, not necessarily. I don't necessarily accept that, no. There's a three-way fight going on here. We've got the moderate opposition, we've got the Assad regime, and we've got ISIL. Of course, the Assad regime would like to control all of the territory of Syria, but effectively it's abandoned the east of the country where ISIL is, and its focus is on defending its heartland in the west of the country and taking on the opposition forces that are primarily non-ISIL forces.
That three-way fight, the third part of that fight, is currently being bombed by Russia, by Putin.
The moderate opposition
Right.
is exactly right. The Russian intervention, claimed to be in the name of the fight against ISIL, has been largely directed against the moderate opposition, which tells us that the real intention of Russia's intervention is to shore up the Assad regime. Now, I have no doubt that Russia shares our ambition to destroy ISIL in the longer term, but we have a difference of view about how best to do that. The Russians think you do it by shoring up the Assad regime and then going after ISIL. We don't think you can settle the conflict between Assad and the opposition without agreeing a date and a modality for Assad's departure.
So as things stand, do you look at President Putin and say, you are our ally in this fight?
Not at the moment, but Putin could be our ally if he decides to work with us in order to achieve a political transition. We've got two different struggles here. We've got the struggle against ISIL, which has to be a military struggle. There isn't a deal you can cut with ISIL. There isn't a negotiation to be had with them. They can't be part of the political future of Syria. And then we've got a civil war going on, and everybody is agreed that the solution to that has to be a political one, not a military one. Everybody is agreed that it would be a mistake to dismantle the regime and create a vacuum, as happened in Iraq. What we need to do is remove those with the most blood on their hands at the top of the Assad regime, bring in representatives of the moderate opposition, and form a transitional government in Syria that can take the country forward.
Isn't the truth that we have been outflanked quite rawly and bluntly by President Putin here? And when you look at our strategy in Syria and Iraq against ISIS, you look at the fact Ramadi's fallen, Palmyra's fallen, Mosul's in IS hands. The training of rebel forces is a complete failure with 4 or 5 instead of 5,000. We've got 700 British citizens going to fight for ISIS and a wave, hundreds of thousands of migrants leaving the country. We have no strategy. We have no foreign policy there at all.
Well, it's not true to say we have no strategy, but it is absolutely true to say that the speed and decisiveness of Russia's intervention has taken the international community by surprise, and we are in the process of responding to that. Russia is both carrying out military action and joining us at the table. We'll be meeting again this weekend in Vienna with 19 countries to try and move forward on the political track. The Russians say they want a political solution. They say they accept the need for a political solution, and actually they're
with Assad,
and that's the big point of difference between us and the Russians and Iranians.
I want to look more broadly now at what the Foreign Office does. David Cameron said in 2012, those embassies you've got, turn them into showrooms for cars, department stores for our fashion. That's what's happened, essentially, isn't it?
Well, trade is certainly an important part of the role of our overseas missions, and what we call the prosperity agenda is now embedded in the mainstream of our diplomacy around the world. I've just come from a lunch here in Washington where we've had senior executives from a dozen US companies who are investing in the UK,
and when you look at that,
to encourage them to invest more in the UK.
That prosperity mission, for example, in Saudi Arabia, £5.4 billion of weaponry sold. Is that the right figure? Would you like that figure to be higher?
We'd always like to do more business, more British exports, more British jobs, and in this case, very high-end engineering jobs protected and created by our diplomacy abroad.
Does it matter what Saudi Arabia does with that weaponry? If it's used against civilians in Yemen or against protesters at home?
Yes, it does matter, and we have one of the strictest export licensing regimes in the world. We only export weapon systems where all the criteria of our export licensing system are met.
So you know that those British weapons are not being used in Yemen. You know that?
No, I know that some of them are being used in Yemen. That doesn't make them, that doesn't fall foul of the export licensing criteria. It would be hypocritical to think that we could have a large defence industry exporting weapon systems and that they never get used. What
So
matters,
you don't have a veto in where those weapons are used or how they're used?
What matters is that they are used legally in compliance with international humanitarian law, and we monitor that very carefully.
Well, Saudi Arabia stands accused currently of war crimes in Yemen. Britain signed up to the Arms Control Treaty, which was, I quote, to save lives and ease the immense human suffering caused by armed conflict, David Cameron's words. So if those weapons are being used in Yemen as war crimes, then that carries criminal sanctions for our government.
Yeah, but you've made a huge leap of logic there.
Well, which part of it do you not agree with then? That they weren't war crimes?
Those weapons are being used, some of them are being used in Yemen. The important thing is that they are being used legally in an international armed conflict. There have been accusations of breaches of international humanitarian law. We regularly intervene with the Saudis to encourage them to be transparent with us.
Have you intervened here with their use in Yemen?
Yes, I was in Saudi Arabia a couple of weeks ago and we discussed precisely this issue. And what did they tell you though? That the Saudis deny that there have been any breaches of international humanitarian law. Obviously, that denial alone is not enough. We need to see proper investigations. We need to work with the Saudis to establish that international humanitarian law has been complied with. And we have an export licensing system that responds if we find that it is not. We will then find that we cannot license additional shipments of weapons.
We all understand that there is pragmatism involved in foreign policy, but do you worry that the ethical dimension, the moral dimension, what you came into this job to do, is being lost?
No, I don't. But I think I do draw a distinction between a pulpit approach, which is simply preaching at people, and an engagement approach. If you want to be able to influence the way people behave, you have to be engaged with them. You have to have some leverage in your discussions with them. And countries like Saudi Arabia, where we have strong collaboration, we work together in many areas, not just trade, but security as well. We collaborate on security with Saudi Arabia in a way which saves British lives, our intelligence collaboration. But that gives us an ability to discuss with them the more difficult issues as well, and to get results.